In this edition of Doc TV's monster horror documentary series, we'll examine the phenomenon of scary movies. Why do they endure? Why are they so popular? Get ready to learn all about the horror of it all. Did you know that one of the world's greatest inventors made a horror movie? Scary movies have flickered with fear since Thomas Edison first figured out how to project images in a dimly lit room. Frankenstein is a 1910 American short silent horror film produced by Edison Studios. It was directed by J. Seale Dawley, who also wrote the one-reelist screenplay, broadly basing his scenario on Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Film historians typically acknowledge this short motion picture as the first screen adaptation of Shelley's work. Horror films frequently explore dark subjects and may deal with transgressive matters or themes. Broad features possess monsters, apocalyptic events, and religious or folk beliefs. Cinematic techniques employed in horror films have been demonstrated to cause psychological reactions in an audience. We'll get to those effects a little later. First, let's dive into the horror genre and what it is. Horror movies have existed for over a century. From origins in silent films and German Expressionism, horror became a codified genre after the release of 1931's Dracula. Many subgenres appeared in the following decades, including comedy horror, body horror, supernatural horror, psychological horror, and slasher films. The genre has been delivered worldwide, ranging in content and style between regions. Horror is especially celebrated in the cinema of Korea, Japan, Thailand, and Italy, among other countries. Despite being the topic of social and legal debate because of their subject matter, some horror films and franchises have seen major commercial triumphs, impacted society, and generated several popular culture icons. Most recently, a silent and murderous clown named Art who went on a cinematic rampage for the ages. The Dictionary of Film Studies characterizes horror films as representing disturbing and dark subject matter, seeking to elicit responses of fear, terror, disgust, shock, suspense, and of course, horror from their viewers. In the chapter, The American Nightmare, Horror in the 70s, from Hollywood, from Vietnam to Reagan, film critic Robin Woods stated that the commonality between horror films is that normality is threatened by the monster. This was also expanded upon by the philosophy of horror, or paradoxes of the heart, by Noel Carroll, who added that repulsion must be pleasurable, as evidenced by the genre's popularity. Before the release of Dracula, historian Gary Don Rhodes demonstrated that the idea and terminology of horror film did not exist yet as a codified genre. However, critics used the term horror to characterize films in reviews before the release of Dracula. Horror was a term utilized to explain a variety of meanings. In 1913, Moving Picture World defined horrors as showcasing striped convicts, murderous Indians, grinning blackhanders, homicidal drunkards. During the silent era, horror was used to describe everything from battle scenes in war films to tales of drug addiction. Historian Gary Don Rhodes remarked that the term horror film or horror movie was not employed in early cinema. The mystery film genre was in vogue, and early data on Dracula being advertised as a mystery film was typical, despite the novel play and film story depending on the paranormal. Newman discussed the genre in British Film Institute's Companion to Horror, where he remarked that horror films in the 1930s were easy to determine. Still, following that decade, the more blurred distinctions become, and horror becomes less like a discrete genre than an effect which can be deployed within any number of narrative settings or narratives patterns. Mark Jankovic, in an essay, declared that there is no simple collective belief as to what constitutes the horror genre between fans and critics of the genre. Jankovic discovered that conflicts existed among audiences who wanted to differentiate themselves. This varied from fans of different genres who may view a film like 1979's Alien as belonging to science fiction, and horror fan bases overlooking it as being inauthentic to either genre. Further arguments exist among fans of the genre with personal definitions of true horror films, such as fans who welcome cult figures like Freddy Krueger of the A Nightmare on Elm Street series. In contrast, others disassociate themselves from characters and franchises and concentrate on genre auteur directors like Dario Argento. At the same time, other fans would deem Argento's films too mainstream, with preferences for more underground films. Andrew Tudor wrote in Monsters and Mad Scientists, "A cultural history of the horror movie suggested that genre is what we collectively believe it to be. When pertaining to the horror genre and its millions of rabid fans, truer words have never been spoken. Opinions about the supernatural, devils, and ghosts have existed in mythology and beliefs of many cultures for centuries. These would become essential parts of the horror genre. Zombies, for example, arose from Haitian folklore. Before film development in the late 1890s, Gothic fiction was created. These included 1818's Frankenstein and short stories by Edgar Allan Poe, which would later have several film adaptations. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, more key horror texts would be conceived than in any other period preceding it. While they were not all straight horror stories, the horrific elements of them lingered in popular culture, with their set pieces becoming staples in horror cinema. Time for a haunting history lesson like no other. Critic and author Kim Newman described Georges Méliès' Le Manoir du Diable as the first horror film featuring elements that would become staples: images of ghosts, haunted castles, and demons. The early 20th century cinema was rife with hectic film production. Horrific stories were being doled out at a frantic pace, including everything from Poe adaptations made in the United States and France to Frankenstein adaptations made in Italy and the US. The most adapted of these stories was The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which had 3 versions made in 1920 alone. Early German cinema concerned Poe-like stories, such as The Student of Prague, featuring director and actor Paul Wegener. Wegener would go on to work in comparable features, such as The Golem and The Dancing Girl and its related Golan films. Other era actors featured in similar films included Werner Krauss and Conrad Veidt, who starred in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, leading to similar roles in other German productions. In 1922, F.W.E. Murnau would also direct an adaptation of Nosferatu, a film Newman characterized as standing as the only screen adaptation of Dracula to be primarily interested in horror. From the character's rat-like features and thin body, the film was, even more so than Caligari, a template for the horror film. After the success of the Broadway play Dracula, Universal Studios officially bought the rights to both the stage show and the novel. After Dracula's premiere on February 12, 1931, the film received what authors of the book Universal Horrors proclaimed as uniformly positive, some even laudatory reviews. The commercial reception surprised Universal, who forged ahead to make similar production of Frankenstein in 1931. Frankenstein also proved to be a hit for Universal, leading to both Dracula and Frankenstein making film stars of their leads: Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. Karloff starred in Universal's 1932 follow-up The Mummy, which Newman described as the studio knowing what they were getting, but turning the film close to the plot of Dracula. Lugosi and Karloff would star together in several Poe adaptations in the 1930s. Following the release of Dracula, the Washington Post stated the film's box office win led to a rotation of comparable films. At the same time, the New York Times noted in a 1936 overview that Dracula and the arrival of the sound cinema kick-started the real triumph of these spectral thrillers. Other studios started creating horror projects with Warner Brothers, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and Paramount Pictures. Universal would also follow up with several horror films until the mid-1930s. In 1935, the president of the BBFC, Edward Short, wrote, "Although a separate category has been established for these horrific films, I am sorry to learn they are on the increase. I hope that the producers and renters will accept this word of warning and discourage this type of subject as far as possible." As the United Kingdom was a considerable market for Hollywood, American producers listened to Short's warning, and the number of Hollywood-produced horror films decreased in 1936. In the trade paper Variety, it was reported that Universal Studios' forsaking of horror films after the release of 1936's Dracula's Daughter was that European countries, especially England, are prejudiced against this type product. At the end of the decade, a profitable re-release of Dracula and Frankenstein would inspire Universal to deliver Son of Frankenstein in 1939, featuring both Lugosi and Karloff, starting a resurrection of the horror film that would persist into the mid-1940s. After the triumph of Son of Frankenstein, Universal's horror films received what author Rick Werland of the horror film called a second wind. Universal looked into their 1930s horror properties to develop new follow-ups in their The Invisible Man and the Mummy franchises. Universal noticed potential in making actor Lon Chaney Jr. a new star to replace Karloff, as Chaney had not differentiated himself in either A or B pictures. Chaney Jr. would become a horror star for the decade, leading in the Wolfman series films and then portraying several of Universal's monster characters. B Picture Studios also developed films that imitated the style of Universal's horror output. Karloff worked with Columbia Pictures, acting in various films as a mad doctor-type character, starting with The Man They Could Not Hang. Lugosi worked between Universal and Poverty Row Studios, such as producers releasing Corporation plc for 1941's The Devil Bat and Monogram for 9 feature films. In March 1942, producer Val Lewton terminated his working relationship with independent producer David O. Selznick to work for RKO Radio Pictures' Charles Corner, becoming the head of a new unit designed to create B-movie horror feature films. According to screenwriter DeWitt Bodine and director Jacques Tourneur, Lewton's first horror production, 1942's The Cat People, Lewton desired to create something distinct from Universal horror. Tourneur described Lewton's desire to manipulate the horror formula into something new by making something intelligent and in good taste. Lewton produced a series of horror films for RKO, described by Newman as polished, doom-haunted, poetic. Film critic Roger Ebert stated that Lewton's films in the 1940s were landmarks in American movie history. Several horror films of the 1940s borrowed from Cat People, mainly by featuring a female character who fears that she has inherited the inclination to shift into a monster or try to reproduce the shadowy visual style of the film. Between 1947 and 1951, Hollywood made almost no new horror films. It was like a horror prohibition, and fans were starved for content. This was due to steeply falling sales, leading Major and Poverty Row Studios to re-release their older horror films instead of creating new ones during this time. The early 1950s featured only a handful of Gothic horror films produced before Hammer Film Productions' Gothic films were released. Hammer started creating American-style science fiction movies in the early 1950s, but subsequently diverged into horror with their 1958 color films The Curse of Frankenstein and The Horror Dracula. These movies would birth 2 horror film stars, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, and led to further horror film productions from Hammer in the following decade. Among the most influential horror films of the 1950s was The Thing from Another World, with Newman stating that the decade's countless science fiction horror films would follow in its style. For 5 years after the release of The Thing from Another World, nearly every film concerning aliens, radioactive mutants, or dinosaurs would be dealt with matter-of-fact characters, as seen in the movie. Films featuring werewolves, vampires, and the Frankenstein monster are also accepted to have science fiction elements of the era, such as characters with similar plot elements from Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The horror film transformed dramatically in 1960 specifically with Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho, based on the novel by Robert Bloch. The film advanced the idea of a multiple personality serial killer, setting the tone for future films that were only touched upon in earlier features. The release of Psycho led to comparable films about the psychosis of characters and a brief reappearance of tasteful horror films like Robert Wise's The Haunting and Jack Clayton's The Innocents. Newman stated that Roman Polanski's 1968 thriller Rosemary's Baby was the other event horror film of the 1960s after Psycho. Roger Corman worked with American International Pictures to make House of Usher, which led to several Poe adaptations. With these projects, he supplied parts for senior horror stars such as Karloff and Chaney. Junior Corman made these movies to compete with the British colour horror films from Hammer in the United Kingdom, featuring their horror stars Cushing and Terence Fisher, whose Frankenstein series continued from 1958 to 1973. Competition for Hammer emerged in the mid-1960s in the United Kingdom with Amicus Productions, who also produced a feature film starring Cushing and Lee. Like Psycho, Amicus drew from modern sources such as Bloch. This approach led to Hammer adapting works by more authors from the era. In 1960, Mario Bava's Black Sunday marked an increase in on-screen violence in film. Earlier British horror films had their gorier scenes edited on an initial release or implied through narration, while Psycho presented its violence through quick editing. Black Sunday, by contrast, showed violence without suggestion. This brutality would later be seen in other works of Bava and Italian films, like The Giallo of Lucio Fulci and Dario Argento. Other independent American productions of the 1960s expanded on the gore shown in the movie in a genre later described as the splatter film, with movies by Herschel Gordon Lewis like Blood Feast. The true breakthrough of these independent films was George A. Romero's 1968 classic, Night of the Living Dead, which set new attitudes for the horror film, one that was suspicious of authority figures, broke taboos of society, and was satirical between its more suspenseful set pieces. Historian John Kenneth Muir described the 70s as a truly eclectic time for horror cinema, citing a mixture of fresh and more personal efforts on film. In contrast, others were a resurrection of older characters that have appeared since the 30s and 40s. Night of the Living Dead had a slow-burning influence on the era's horror films, and Romero was heralded as the first of the genre auteurs who worked outside studio settings. These included American directors like Tobe Hooper, John Carpenter, Brian De Palma, and Wes Craven, and directors working outside America like David Cronenberg, Dario Argento, and Bob Clark. Before Night of the Living Dead, the monsters of horror films could quickly be banished or defeated by the film's ending. In contrast, Romero's and other filmmakers' films often suggest other horrors still lingered after the credits, sometimes long after the credits. The final scene of Night of the Living Dead will continue in infamy for decades to come. Both Amicus and Hammer concluded feature film production in the 1970s. Remakes were popular for horror films in the 70s, with films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Tales based on Dracula, which continued into the late 70s with John Badham's Dracula and Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire. Although not an official remake, the last high-grossing horror film of the decade, Alien, took B-movie elements from movies like it. The Terror from Beyond Space, Newman has suggested that high-grossing films like Alien, Jaws, and Halloween became hits by being relentless suspense machines with high visual sophistication. He continued that Jaws' memorable music theme, and its monster not being the product of society like Norman Bates in Psycho, had carried over into Halloween's Michael Myers and its film's theme music. Another film that benefited from its theme music was 1973's The Exorcist, directed by William Friedkin and written for the screen by William Peter Blatty, based on his 1971 novel of the same name. The Exorcist stars Ellen Burstyn, Max von Sydow, Lee J. Cobb, Kitty Wynn, Jack McGowran, Jason Miller, and Linda Blair. It follows the demonic possession of a young girl and her mother's attempt to rescue her through an exorcism conducted by a pair of Catholic priests. The book was a bestseller, but Blatty, who also produced, and Friedkin, his choice for director, had difficulty casting the film. Unable to hire major era stars, they cast relative unknowns, Burstyn, Blair, and Miller, who was the author of a hit play with no film acting experience, choices vigorously opposed by Warner Brothers executives. Principal photography was also tricky. Friedkin insisted on realism, going to northern Iraq to film the prologue despite political instability in the region, relying on live special effects, and casting real priests and medical personnel in the film. The crew also recalled that he was temperamental, often firing people without warning. A fire destroyed most of the set, some crew members died, and Blair and Burstyn suffered accidental long-term back injuries. He also deliberately made cast members uncomfortable, going as far as refrigerating the set where the exorcism scenes took place to temperatures well below zero so their breath would be visible. Production took twice as long as scheduled and cost almost 3 times the initial budget. Some deaths and accidents have led to a belief that the film was cursed. The Exorcist was released in 24 United States and Canadian theaters in late December 1973. Audiences flocked to it despite mixed reviews, waiting in long lines during winter weather, many more than once. The sold-out shows were even more profitable for Warner's since they had booked it into those theaters under 4-wall distribution rental agreements, the first time a major studio had done that. Some viewers suffered adverse physical reactions, fainting or vomiting to scenes in which the protagonist undergoes a realistic cerebral angiography and later violently masturbates with a crucifix. Heart attacks and a miscarriage were reported among viewers. A psychiatric journal published a paper on cinematic neurosis triggered by the film. Many children were allowed to see it, leading to charges that the Motion Picture Association Rating Board had accommodated Warner Brothers by giving the film an R rating instead of the X rating they thought it deserved to ensure its commercial success. Several cities tried to ban it outright or stop children from attending. The cultural conversation around the film, which also surrounded its treatment of Catholicism, and in the years since its apparent anti-feminism, helped it become the first horror film to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. The Exorcist was nominated for 10 Oscars and won 2 Best Sound and Best Adapted Screenplay. It has had multiple sequels, including a television series, and was the highest-grossing R-rated horror film until the 2017 release of Stephen King's It. The Exorcist has significantly influenced popular culture and has received critical acclaim, with several publications regarding it as one of the greatest horror films ever made. In 2010, the Library of Congress selected the film to be preserved in its National Film Registry, citing it as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. With the advent of home video in the 1980s, horror films were subject to censorship in the United Kingdom in a spectacle popularly known as video nasties, leading to video collections being taken by police and some people being imprisoned for selling or owning some horror films. Some believe this ridiculous situation made horror films dumber than the previous decade. Although films were not less gory, they seemed less personal and more disposable. Directors who created original material during the 70s, like Carpenter, Cronenberg, and Hooper, would at least briefly make safer films, such as Stephen King adaptations or remakes of the 50s horror material. Replacing Frankenstein's monster and Dracula were new popular characters like Friday the 13th's Jason Voorhees, Halloween's Michael Myers, and A Nightmare on Elm Street's Freddy Krueger. Unlike the movie monsters of the past, which were created by mad scientists or were supernatural in origin, these characters were people with common-sounding names who developed the slasher film genre of the time. Despite being derided by several contemporary film critics of the time, horror movies were often highly profitable at the box office. It wasn't just slasher movies that owned the decade of excess. The 80s highlighted several films about body transformation through special effects and makeup artists like Rob Bottin and Rick Baker, who allowed for more detailed and graphic transformation scenes of the human body in various forms of horrific transformation. The Howling, An American Werewolf in London, and John Carpenter's The Thing are standouts of outstanding practical transformative effects work. Traditional styles continued into the 80s, such as supernatural-themed movies concerning ghosts, haunted houses, and demonic possession. Among the most popular films of the type included Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and Hooper's high-grossing Poltergeist. The release of films based on Stephen King's books, like Carrie and The Shining, led to further film adaptations of his novels throughout the decade. Even now, the work of Stephen King continues to carve a path of bloody destruction through our hallowed horror-loving halls. Horror films of the 1990s also failed to develop as many significant new directors of the genre as they had in the 60s or 70s. Young independent filmmakers such as Richard Linklater, Kevin Smith, Quentin Tarantino, and Michael Moore broke into cinema outside of the genre at non-genre festivals like the Sundance Film Festival. The early 90s was deemed a poor time for horror by many film critics, due in part to its excessive release of sequels, and wow, there were undoubtedly a lot of them. Other genre-based trends of the decade included postmodern horror films like Scream were made during this period. Postmodern horror films continued into the 2000s, eventually just being released as humorous parody films. By the end of the 90s, 3 films had won the hearts of horror fans. These included Hideo Nakata's Ring, The Sixth Sense, and the low-budget independent film The Blair Witch Project. Original teen-oriented franchises kicked off the 2000s with movies like Final Destination. At the same time, the success of the remake of William Castle's House on Haunted Hill led to a series of remakes during the decade. The popularity of the remake of Dawn of the Dead led to a resurgence in American zombie films in the late 2000s, which in and of itself led to the cultural phenomenon known as The Walking Dead. Beyond remakes, other long-dormant horror franchises such as The Exorcist and Friday the 13th received new feature films. After Ring's success, several films came from Hong Kong, South Korea, Thailand, and Japan with similar detective plotlines investigating ghosts. This trend was echoed in the West with films with similar plots and Hollywood remakes of Asian movies like The Ring. The United Kingdom saw a modest revival of British horror films, including Shaun of the Dead and 28 Days Later. David Edelstein of the New York Times coined a term for a genre he described as torture porn in a 2006 article as a label for films described, often retroactively, to over 40 films since 2003. Edelstein lumped in films such as Saw, Wolf Creek, and Hostel under this banner, suggesting the audience a titillating and shocking. Film scholars of early 21st century horror films described them as intense bodily acts and visible bodily representations to produce uneasy reactions. Using the Saw film series as an example, Kevin Wetmore suggested these films reflected a post-9/11 attitude towards increasing pessimism, precisely one of no redemption no hope, no expectations that we're going to be okay. After the film studio, Blumhouse had a hit with Paranormal Activity in 2007. The studio continued making films that became hits in the 2010s with films like Insidious and Sinister. This led to films like Get Out and franchises like The Purge. In her article for Vanity Fair, Laura Bradley noted that both large and small film studios began noticing Blumhouse's success, including A24, which became popular with films like The Witch and Midsommar. Bradley remarked how some of these films had been categorized as elevated horror, a term used for works that were elevated beyond traditional or pure genre films, but declared horror aficionados and some critics pushed back against the notion that these films are doing something entirely new, noting their roots in films like Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby. The increased use of streaming services in the 2010s has also been proposed as boosting the popularity of horror, as well as Netflix and Amazon Prime Video producing and circulating considerable works in the genre. A new streaming service known as Shudder launched in 2015 as a horror-specific service. Backed by ANC Networks, Shudder met with success after the failure of previous efforts such as Universal's Chiller Network and Lionsgate's Fear Net. The 2020s started in a truly horrific manner. The beginning of the decade was marred by the COVID-19 pandemic, which significantly impacted the film industry, leading to several horror films being held back from release or having their production halted. During lockdowns, streaming for movies featuring a fictional apocalypse increased. Times were very dark. However, one film that kicked off production pre-pandemic in 2020 before being halted would soon prove to be a bright yet overtly bloody spot in the horror history books. That film would become 2022's sequel, Terrifier 2, directed by Damien Leone. Written, directed, edited, and produced by Leone, Terrifier 2 is a sequel to 2016's Terrifier. Funding for the film was exacting as the script was more ambitious than the first film and needed a bigger budget. Leone secured finances from private investors before filming, and he launched an Indiegogo campaign with a $50,000 goal to film a practical effects-driven scene. The campaign was a tremendous success, reaching over 430% of the initial goal, with over $200,000 coming in via the crowdfunding platform. Though production was up and running in the first half of 2020, the film would eventually take about 3 years to complete due to a myriad of reasons, including the pandemic. Terrifier 2 had its world premiere at the London Fright Fest on August 29, 2022. It was theatrically released in the United States on October 6, becoming a surprise hit at the box office, grossing $11.5 million, over 40 times its budget. Terrifier 2 was met with generally positive reviews from critics, with high praise for David Howard Thornton as the villainous Art the Clown and Lauren Rivera's final girl portrayal of Sienna Shaw. Like The Exorcist, the film became a cultural phenomenon, with people fainting and throwing up in theaters. However, these illnesses were attributed to Leone's incredibly graphic practical effects instead of the demonic subject matter. Now that you know the history of horror films, let's look at some of the most popular horror subgenres. Body horror. A genre that emerged in the 70s, body horror films focus on bodily transformation. In these films, the body is either engulfed by some larger process or heading toward fragmentation and collapse. In these films, the focus can be on the apocalyptic implication of an entire society being overtaken. Still, the focus is generally upon an individual and their sense of identity, primarily than watching their body change. The subgenre's earliest appearance was director David Cronenberg's work, specifically with early films like Shivers. Mark Jankovic of the University of Manchester declared that the transformation scenes in the genre provoke fear and repulsion, but also pleasure and excitement, such as in 1982's The The Thing and 1986's The Fly. Comedy horror. Comedy horror combines elements of comedy and horror film. The comedy horror genre often crosses over with the black comedy genre. It occasionally includes horror films with lower ratings aimed at a family audience. The short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, is cited as the first great comedy horror story. Folk horror. Folk horror uses elements of folklore or other religious and cultural beliefs to instill fear in audiences. Folk horror films have featured rural settings, isolation, religion, and nature themes. Frequently cited examples are Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, The Wicker Man, and Midsummer. Local folklore and beliefs have been noted as prevalent in horror films from Southeast Asia, including Thailand and Indonesia. Found footage horror. The found footage horror film technique gives the audience a first-person view of the events on screen and presents the footage as being discovered after. Horror films, framed as being made up of found footage, merge the experiences of the audience and characters, which may induce suspense, shock, and bafflement. Alexandra Heller Nicholas noted that the popularity of sites like YouTube in 2006 sparked a taste for amateur media, leading to the production of other films in the found footage horror genre later in the 2000s, including the particularly financially successful Paranormal Activity. Gothic horror. In their book, Gothic Film, Richard J. McRoy and Richard J. Hand stated that Gothic could be argued as a very loose subgenre of horror. Still, it's claimed that Gothic was a style like a film noir and not bound to certain cinematic elements like the Western or science fiction. The term Gothic is frequently used to describe a stylized approach to showcasing location, desire, and action in film. Contemporary views of the genre associate it with imagery of castles at hilltops and labyrinth-like ancestral mansions in various disrepair states. Narratives in these films often focus on an audience's fear and attraction to social change and rebellion. The genre can be applied to cinema as early as The Haunted Castle and Frankenstein, as well as to more complex iterations such as Park Chan-wook's Stoker and Jordan Peele's Get Out. Natural horror. Also described as eco-horror, the natural horror film is a subgenre featuring nature running amok in the form of mutated beasts, carnivorous insects, and normally harmless animals or plants turned into cold-blooded killers. In 1963, Hitchcock defined a new genre of nature taking revenge on humanity with the birds, which was expanded into a trend into the 70s. Following the success of Willard, a film about killer rats, and an official sequel, Ben, other films followed suit, such as Night of the Lepus, Frogs, Bugs Squirm, and what Muir described as the turning point in the genre with Jaws, which became the highest-grossing film at that point and moved the animal attacks genres towards a less fantastic route with less giant animals and more real-life creatures such as grizzly and night creature orca and Jaws 2. Slasher film. The slasher film is a horror subgenre that involves a killer murdering a group of people, usually teenagers, usually by use of bladed tools. In his book on the genre, author Adam Rockoff that these villains represented a rogue genre of films with tough, problematic, and fiercely individualistic. Following the financial success of Friday the 13th, at least 20 other slasher films appeared in 1980 alone. These films usually revolved around 5 properties: unique social settings like campgrounds, schools, holidays, and a crime from the past committed, such as accidental drowning, infidelity, and a scorned lover. Add in a ready-made group of victims, and you have the recipe for carnage. The genre was derided by several contemporary film critics of the era, such as Ebert, and often was highly profitable at the box office. The release of Scream led to a brief revival of slasher films in the 90s. Supernatural horror. Supernatural horror films integrate supernatural elements, such as the afterlife, spirit possession, and religion into the horror genre. Supernatural horror became prevalent in the 20s and the early 30s with German expressionist films. Paul Meehan said the style created a nightmarish netherworld of supernatural fear. The genre became more commercially popular in the 30s, with Universal Studios producing Universal Monsters films. The films were set in a mythical Transylvania or other Eastern European locale, in an unreal fantasy world far divorced from the everyday. Meehan said, "This served to make the creatures of the night that populated these films into harmless chimeras, comfortably ensconced in the faraway past." In the early 40s, supernatural horror films had more contemporary settings, but psychological horror films ultimately superseded the genre. By the end of World War II, the supernatural horror genre met its demise, being overshadowed by the atrocities of the war. By the 50s, science fiction horror films have replaced supernatural horror films, and psychological horror films also became more popular in the same decade, ultimately eclipsing supernatural horror. In the 60s, horror films like The Innocents, The Haunting, and Rosemary's Baby used supernatural elements but were not directly about the paranormal. Other horror films used supernatural themes to code elements being censored by the Motion Picture Production Code. The Haunting featured a female protagonist interested in another woman, and she was a queer-coded character. Such characters were commonplace in the history of supernatural horror films. Sue Matheson wrote of Rosemary's Baby. It popularized depictions of witchcraft, demonic activity, and the devil on screen and generated a wave of supernatural horror movies. By the 70s, the films The Exorcist and The Omen revived the supernatural horror genre. Literature was used as source material, like with the earliest movies, with the written works of Stephen King being adapted into Carrie and The Shining. The film Poltergeist was also a genre highlight in the 80s. In the 2000s, violent horror films called torture porn were popular. By the end of the decade, supernatural horror reclaimed its popularity. The found footage film The Blair Witch Project achieved fame in 1999, and the late 2000s Paranormal Activity succeeded with the same film technique, which led to a film series that lasted until the mid-2010s. Supernatural horror films continue to come on strong with the success of affairs like The Conjuring universe, centered around the real-life exploits of paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. Teen horror. Teen horror is a subgenre that victimizes teenagers, usually promoting strong, anti-conformity teenage leads, appealing to young generations. This subgenre often depicts themes of sex, underage drinking, and gore. Horror films aimed at a young audience featuring teenage monsters grew popular in the 50s, with several productions from American International Pictures and productions of Herman Cohen, with I Was a Teenage Werewolf and I Was a Teenage Frankenstein. This led to later productions like Daughter of Dr. Jekyll and Frankenstein's Daughter. Teen horror cycle in the 80s often showcased explicit gore and nudity, with John Kenneth Muir described as cautionary conservative tales, where most of the films stated if you partook in such vices as drugs or sex, your punishment of death would be handed out. Before Scream, no popular teen horror films existed in the early 90s. After the financial success of Scream, teen horror films became increasingly reflexive and self-aware, with films like I Know What You Did Last Summer and non-slasher The Faculty. The genre lost prominence as teen films dealt with threats with more realism in films like Donnie Darko and Crazy Beautiful. In her book on the 90s teen horror cycle, Alexandra West described the general trend of these films, as often looked down upon by critics, journals, and fans as too glossy, trendy, and sleek to be considered worthwhile horror films. Psychological horror. Psychological horror is a subgenre of horror and psychological fiction, focusing on mental, emotional, and psychological states to frighten, disturb, or unsettle its audience. The subgenre frequently overlaps with the related subgenre of the psychological thriller. It often uses mystery elements and characters with unstable, unreliable, or disturbing psychological states to enhance the suspense, drama, action, and paranoia of the setting and plot and provide an unpleasant, unsettling, or distressing atmosphere. With all of this spooky coming on hard, one has to wonder, are there any psychological or physical effects stemming from watching horror movies? In a study by Ure Hassan, brain waves were observed via functional magnetic resonance imaging. This study used the intersubject correlation analysis method to determine the results. It was shown that audience members simultaneously focus on specific facets in a particular scene and sit as still as possible while watching horror films. In another study by John Green and Glenn Sparks, it was found that the audience tends to experience the excitation transfer process, which causes physiological arousal in audience members. The ETP refers to the feelings experienced immediately after an emotion-arousing experience, such as watching a horror film. In this case, audience members' heart rates, blood pressure, and respiration increased while watching violent movies. Audience members with positive feedback regarding the horror film have feelings similar to happiness or joy felt with friends but intensified. Alternatively, audience members with negative feedback regarding the film would typically feel emotions they would generally associate with negative experiences in their life. A 2021 study suggested horror films exploring grief can provide psychological benefits to the bereaved, with the genre well suited to representing grief through its conventions. Another technique used in horror films to provoke a response from the audience is cognitive dissonance, when someone experiences tension in themselves and is urged to relieve it. Dissonance is the clashing of unpleasant or harsh sounds. A study by Preet identified that the ability to recognize dissonance relied on the left hemisphere of the brain, while consonance relied on the right half. There is a stronger preference for unity. This difference is noticeable even in the early stages of life. Previous musical experience also can influence a dislike for dissonance. Skin conductance responses, heart rate, and electromyographic responses vary in response to emotional stimuli, showing higher negative emotions in what is known as the negative bias. When applied to dissonant music, heart rate decreases, skin conductance responses increase, and facial electromyographic responses are higher. The typical reactions go through a two-step process of orienting to the problem, then a defensive process. This initial response can sometimes result in a fight or flight response, a characteristic of dissonance that horror films rely on to frighten and unsettle viewers. Scary movies will continue to intrigue and thrill the public at large. People continue to seek out the darker parts of our world with glee and curiosity, and who could blame them? Sometimes those things can be lots of fun. Join us for another episode of Doc TV's monster horror documentary series soon.